Midnight in the Persian Gulf. USS Gerald R. was already turning into the wind to launch the first strike package. The retaliatory order had come from the White House exactly 90 minutes ago, ending weeks of escalation with a single kinetic command. Within the next 6 hours, the entire Iranian command and control network would either be offline or in ruins. The air on the flight deck was thick with the smell of JP-5 jet fuel and the heavy, humid salt of the Gulf. Floodlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the steam rising from the catapult tracks while the deck shuddered under the weight of 100,000 tons of steel moving at 30 knots. On Catapult 1, an FA-18 fighter from Strike Fighter Squadron 87 sat straining against the holdback bar. The pilot, a lieutenant commander with 12 years of experience, pushed the throttles to full afterburner. A twin column of blue-white flame erupted from the exhaust, bleaching the darkness of the flight deck and throwing a wall of heat against the blast deflectors. With a sudden, violent jolt, the catapult fired, hurling the 30-ton aircraft from 0 to 250 kilometers per hour in under 3 seconds. The fighter disappeared over the bow, its navigation lights blinking once before it climbed into the moonless sky. This was the beginning of a coordinated effort involving 48 combat aircraft and over 12,000 personnel across the carrier strike group. Behind the first fighter, the deck crew moved with a rhythmic, lethal efficiency. Yellow-shirted taxi directors used glowing wands to guide the next aircraft into position, their movements precise and urgent. By 12:15 in the morning, catapults 2, 3, and 4 were all active, launching a mix of FA-18 fighters and EA-18 Golf Growlers into the night. Every sailor on the deck understood the stakes. This was not a drill, but a high-stakes demonstration of American reach and precision. The mission, designated Operation Iron Resolve, was a direct response to the recent drone attacks on commercial shipping. The tactical objective was absolute: the total destruction of the Iranian command and control nodes located between Bandar Abbas and the city of Shiraz. To achieve this, the air wing had been divided into 3 distinct waves. The first wave, currently forming up at coordinates 25 degrees north and 54 degrees east, consisted of electronic warfare assets and suppression of enemy air defense units. Their job was to kick down the door, blinding the enemy before the heavy hitters arrived. High above the carrier, an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft circled at 30,000 feet. Its massive radar dome rotated slowly, painting a digital picture of the entire Persian Gulf for the commanders below. The mission controllers inside the Hawkeye were already tracking the first wave of fighters as they reached their assembly point. They coordinated with land-based tankers from the United States Air Force, ensuring that every aircraft in the strike package had enough fuel to reach their deep inland targets and return to the ship. Inside the Combat Direction Center of the USS Gerald R. the atmosphere was one of clinical professionalism. There were no raised voices or unnecessary movements. The commanding officer of the carrier strike group stood behind a row of glowing monitors, watching the blue icons of his aircraft move steadily toward the Iranian coastline. Each icon represented a pilot, a machine, and a specific set of high-precision munitions designed to dismantle a nation's ability to coordinate its military forces. The room hummed with the sound of cooling fans and the low murmur of tactical reports. The electronic signatures of the strike package were kept to a minimum. The aircraft ran with their radars in passive mode, relying on the data link from the Hawkeye to see the world around them. They were ghosts in the night, moving at 900 kilometers per hour toward a coastline that was currently unaware of the hammer about to fall. The Iranian radar operators on the coast would see nothing until the electronic warfare aircraft began their jam, and by then, it would be too late to mount a coordinated defense. At 12:45 in the morning, the last of the tankers finished their offload and peeled away. The strike package was now fully fueled and armed with a variety of AGM-88 HARM missiles and 1,000-pound Joint Direct Attack munitions. The flight leads checked in with a series of short, coded bursts over the radio, confirming that all systems were green. The formation turned north-northeast, crossing the invisible line that marked the beginning of Iranian-controlled airspace. The sea below was a black void, occasionally broken by the white wake of a patrol boat or the lights of a distant oil rig. For the pilots in the cockpits, the world was reduced to the green glow of their heads-up displays and the distant stars above. They were the tip of the spear, the physical manifestation of a superpower's resolve. In the next hour, the silence of the Gulf would be shattered by the sound of supersonic engines and the roar of 1,000 explosions as they approached the Iranian integrated air defense system. 4 EA-18 Gulf Growlers led the way, carving an invisible path through the electromagnetic spectrum as they crossed into Iranian-controlled airspace. These aircraft, assigned to Electronic Attack Squadron 130, were the silent vanguard of the strike. Their mission was to paralyze the Iranian integrated air defense system before a single kinetic weapon was released. At 30,000 feet, the air was thin and freezing. But inside the cockpits, the crews were enveloped in the low, rhythmic hum of the AN/ALQ-99 tactical jamming pods. The scent of ozone and recycled oxygen filled the small spaces as the electronic warfare officers in the rear seats manipulated the flow of invisible energy. The electronic shield was not a physical barrier, but a localized storm of high-powered radio frequency interference. As the Growlers approached the coast near Bandar-e-Jask, they initiated a broad-spectrum jam, flooding the Iranian early warning radars with a wall of electronic noise. On the ground, the Iranian radar operators saw their screens dissolve into a flickering mess of white static and phantom contacts. The Growlers were not just hiding the strike package, they were actively attacking the enemy's ability to perceive reality. To the Iranian defense network, it appeared as though 1,000 ghost targets were appearing and vanishing across every frequency at once. The effectiveness of the electronic attack relied on precise coordination with the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye orbiting further out at sea. Using high-speed data links, the Hawkeye fed real-time intelligence to the Growlers, identifying which Iranian radar sites were attempting to burn through the interference. At 12:55 in the morning, a long-range surveillance radar at latitude 25 degrees 38 minutes north began to pulse with increased power. The electronic warfare officer in the lead Growler reacted instantly, slaving 2 of his high-band jamming pods to the specific frequency of the Iranian sensor. Within seconds, the Iranian radar was completely blinded. The electronic shield expanded to cover a corridor 120 kilometers wide, providing a safe passage for the following waves of FA-18 fighters. This was the kick-down-the-door phase of the operation, where the goal was to achieve total electromagnetic dominance. The United States Navy crews referred to this as screaming, a process of focused energy that physically overloaded the sensitive receivers of the enemy's air defense hardware. The heat generated by the jamming pods was so intense that the aircraft's cooling systems worked at maximum capacity, vibrating the fuselage with a dull, persistent tremor. To the south, on the island of Siri, an Iranian HQ-9 surface-to-air missile battery attempted to achieve a lock on what its computer perceived as a low-flying target. However, the Growlers were already executing a deceptive jamming technique known as range gate pull-off. This maneuver fed the Iranian missile computer false data, making the strike package appear to be several miles away from its actual position. The Iranian battery commanders, frustrated by the flickering data, were forced to switch to manual tracking, which was nearly impossible in the pitch-black conditions of the early morning. The environment of the electronic battle was one of data and light. Inside the Growler cockpits, the multi-function displays glowed with green and amber symbols, representing the unseen threads of the Iranian network being severed one by one. Outside, the world remained dark and silent, with only the faint blue glow of the wingtips visible to the pilots. The salt-heavy air of the Gulf below was invisible to them, replaced by the technical reality of the digital battlefield. Every successful jam was a victory for the safety of the pilots following in their wake, ensuring that the heavy munitions would reach their targets without interference. By 1:15 in the morning, the electronic shield had successfully neutralized 6 major radar installations along the coast. The Iranian command center in Tehran was likely receiving conflicting reports, unable to confirm if they were under a massive air attack or experiencing a systemic failure of their coastal sensors. This confusion was a deliberate part of the United States strategy. By blinding the eyes of the defender, the strike group had stripped away the Iranian ability to launch their own interceptors or coordinate a unified response. The shield had done its job, turning the Iranian airspace into a dark room where the United States Navy held the only flashlight. The Growlers did not slow down. They continued to push inland, trailing the invisible storm of interference behind them like a cape. They were now approaching the more densely defended areas near the city of Minab, where mobile air defense units were known to be hidden in the rugged terrain. The electronic warfare officers adjusted their settings, preparing for the next layer of the Iranian defense. They were the masters of the invisible, and as long as their pods continued to hum, the strike package remained a ghost. 1:20 in the morning. The coastal ridges of southern Iran. The FA-18 fighters of Strike Fighter Squadron 31 moved into their pre-planned launch boxes, flying at 500 meters above the black surface of the Gulf to stay beneath the radar horizon. Each aircraft carried two AGM-88 HARM missiles, weapons specifically designed to home in on the electronic emissions of enemy radar systems. The pilots monitored their tactical displays, waiting for the Iranian HQ-9 surface-to-air missile batteries to paint them with a tracking beam. It was a lethal game of chicken. The American pilots needed the enemy to turn on their radars so the missiles could find their targets. The cockpits were silent, save for the low hum of the environmental control systems and the occasional burst of encrypted data over the tactical link. At 1:22 in the morning, the cockpit of the lead fighter erupted with a series of high-pitched chirps. An Iranian search radar, at coordinates 25 degrees 45 minutes north, 57 degrees 12 minutes east, had detected a flicker of movement and transitioned to a high-power tracking mode. The pilot did not flinch. He slaved his first missile to the source of the emission and squeezed the trigger on the control stick. The AGM-88 HARM shrieked off the rail, its solid-fuel rocket motor illuminating the cockpit in a brief orange flash that reflected off the pilot's gold-tinted visor. The missile climbed rapidly, reaching a speed of over 2,200 kilometers per hour, as it followed the invisible thread of the radar beam back to its source. 3 miles away, the Iranian radar crew realized their error and shut down the transmitter. But it was too late. The HARM missile's onboard computer had already memorized the last known coordinates of the emission. The missile dived from the sky at a steep angle. The warhead detonated 10 meters above the radar van, sending thousands of tungsten cubes through the sensitive electronics and igniting the fuel tanks of the support vehicles. A secondary explosion followed, a bright white bloom of burning magnesium and diesel that was visible to the American pilots even through their night vision goggles. The impact sent a shockwave through the desert sand, tossing light vehicles onto their sides like toys. The perimeter was breaking. Across a 60-kilometer front, more HARM missiles were finding their marks, decapitating the Iranian air defense network. Without their long-range sensors, the remaining surface-to-air missile batteries were reduced to firing blindly into the dark or waiting for visual acquisition, which was impossible against the low observable profiles of the Navy fighters. The air above the coast was now a graveyard of electronic signals. The smell of hot metal and burnt propellant lingered in the wake of the departing fighters. With the coastal defense shattered, the path was now clear for the heavy strike packages to move toward the command bunkers deep inland near Shiraz. The coordination between the suppression aircraft and the electronic warfare Growlers remained seamless. As the Growlers pulled their electronic veil back, they intentionally left small gaps in the interference, tempting the Iranian operators to activate their systems. Each time a radar dish turned or a missile guidance computer pinged the sky, a United States Navy pilot was ready with a kinetic response. This was the Wild Weasel tradition updated for the 21st century, a combination of bravery and high-technology precision. By 1:35 in the morning, the coastal defense sector was a digital wasteland, its radars smashed and its communication lines severed. In the rear seat of an FA-18 Gulf, the weapons systems officer checked the status of the remaining targets on his digital map. Green icons indicated neutralized sites, while a few flickering red diamonds marked mobile units attempting to flee into the rugged mountain passes of the interior. The pilot banked the aircraft hard to the left, the G-forces pressing both men into their seats as they repositioned for a final sweep of the sector. The canopy was cold to the touch, but the heat from the electronics in the nose of the jet kept the interior cabin warm. Below them, the burning remains of a command van sent a column of oily black smoke into the moonless sky. The destruction of the HQ-9 batteries was the final requirement for the second wave to begin its ingress. Without the long-range eyes of these advanced systems, the Iranian military was effectively blind to the high-altitude bombers and heavy strike fighters now crossing the coastline. The American air crews had executed the suppression of enemy air defenses phase with clinical efficiency, losing no aircraft while neutralizing over 80% of the coastal defense capabilities. The door was not just kicked down, it had been blown off its hinges. The flight leads signaled the transition to the next phase. The first wave of fighters began to orbit over the Gulf, ready to provide cover for the returning strike teams, or to engage any Iranian interceptors that might attempt to scramble from inland bases. The ocean below remained dark, but the horizon was now dotted with the orange glows of multiple fires along the Iranian coast. The electronic shield and the kinetic hammer had worked in perfect tandem, setting the stage for the most dangerous part of the night, the deep strike mission into the heart of the Iranian command network. 1:40 in the morning. The Zagros Mountains. The strike package, consisting of 24 FA-18 fighters, crossed the Iranian shoreline and immediately dropped to an altitude of 300 meters. The transition from the flat, black expanse of the Persian Gulf to the jagged, vertical terrain of the coastal range was instantaneous. The pilots adjusted their flight paths, slaving their navigation systems to the terrain-following radars that projected a glowing green wireframe of the mountains onto their heads-up displays. They were moving at 800 kilometers per hour, weaving through narrow limestone canyons to stay hidden within the radar shadows of the peaks. The air at this altitude was thin and freezing, but the heat from the twin engines radiated through the titanium airframes, creating a shimmering distortion in the night vision goggles of the wingmen. This phase of the operation, known as the Southern Ingress, required absolute concentration and precise station keeping. The fighters flew in tight elements of two, their wingtips less than 10 meters apart as they banked hard around the granite shoulders of the mountains. The G-forces peaked at 4 or 5 times the force of gravity during the sharpest turns, pressing the pilots into their seats and forcing them to use rhythmic breathing to stay conscious. Below them, the mountain passes were silent and dark, with no lights from the remote villages to break the gloom. The only sound was the muffled roar of the jet engines echoing off the canyon walls, a sound that would be gone before anyone on the ground could look up to the sky. The tactical objective of the ingress was to reach the primary target coordinates at latitude 29 degrees north, longitude 52 degrees east, without alerting the inner ring air defenses of the Shiraz command complex. By staying low and fast, the strike package remained invisible to the long-range search radars located on the higher plateaus. The flight leads monitored their digital maps, which were updated in real time by the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye, still orbiting 60 miles out at sea. The data link showed the positions of every friendly aircraft as a steady blue icon, moving in a synchronized line through the heart of the enemy territory. Each FA-18 was heavily laden with two 2,000-pound GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions, specialized bunker-busting bombs designed to penetrate 30 meters of reinforced concrete. The weight of the ordnance made the aircraft less agile, requiring the pilots to plan their turns with greater lead time. The scent of recycled air and the faint metallic tang of the oxygen system filled the cockpits, a sterile contrast to the rugged, ancient landscape passing just a few hundred meters below the wings. The pilots were focused entirely on the mission clock. They had exactly 12 minutes to reach the initial point before the first bombs were scheduled to release. As the formation cleared the first major ridgeline, the city of Shiraz appeared as a distant, amber glow on the horizon to the north. The command and control network was not located in the city itself, but buried deep within the hills to the southwest. The strike package began a shallow climb to 1,000 meters, repositioning themselves for the high-angle dive required for the bunker-busting munitions to achieve maximum kinetic energy. The lead pilot checked his weapon status one last time, ensuring the GPS coordinates for the target were locked into the guidance kits of the bombs. All systems were green. The environment shifted as they reached the higher plateau. The wind increased, buffeting the aircraft as they left the protection of the canyons. The sky was a deep, velvet purple, crowded with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Below, the target area was a dark patch of earth, surrounded by several rings of high-intensity security lights. The pilots knew that within those rings were the short-range point defense systems, anti-aircraft guns, and shoulder-fired missiles that represented the final hurdle before the objective. They tightened their formations, the silence of the cockpit, now broken by the steady, rhythmic pulsing of the combat radars. The final approach began at 1:52 in the morning. The flight leads initiated a combat spread, widening the distance between aircraft to complicate the aim of the ground-based gunners. They were now less than 40 kilometers from the primary command bunker. The tension in the air was palpable, a physical weight that seemed to press down on the flight deck of the carrier miles away, and into the cockpits of the fighters over Iran. The mission had reached its critical point. In the next few minutes, the months of planning and the hours of flight time would culminate in a single, violent strike against the heart of the Iranian military machine. 1:55 in the morning. The targeted hillside south of Shiraz. The lead flight of 4 FA-18 fighters pulled into a steep climb, reaching 4,000 meters, before rolling inverted and pulling the noses down into a 45-degree terminal dive. The target, a reinforced concrete command and control bunker buried 60 meters beneath a limestone ridge, was now centered in the crosshairs of the infrared targeting pods. In the crosshairs of the infrared targeting pods. The air inside the cockpits was cold, but the electronic displays were a feverish green and white, highlighting the heat signatures of the ventilation shafts and the heavy steel blast doors of the facility. The pilots ignored the sudden bloom of tracer fire from the valley floor, focusing entirely on the digital countdown in their heads-up displays. The trigger was squeezed. The 2,000-pound GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munition fell away from the wing station with a heavy, metallic clunk that shuddered through the entire airframe. For a heartbeat, the massive bomb tumbled in the slipstream before its guidance fins snapped open, with a sharp mechanical crack. The weapon hummed as it corrected its flight path, its GPS brain steering it toward the exact coordinates of the primary elevator shaft. The pilot banked the fighter hard to the right, pulling 6 Gs to clear the target area, while the heat from the bomb's internal electronics and the friction of its supersonic descent began to cook the air around the casing. The warhead punched straight through the 12-meter layer of reinforced concrete, capping the shaft, the hardened steel nose cone screaming. As it ground through rebar and stone, there was a delay of exactly 60 milliseconds before the fuse triggered the main explosive charge deep inside the subterranean levels. The Earth itself seemed to heave upward. A massive, muffled detonation followed that cracked the limestone ridge from the inside out, sending a shockwave through the mountain that could be felt in the soles of the pilot's boots 3 kilometers above. A colossal plume of pulverized concrete, gray dust, and orange fire erupted from the ventilation shafts, venting the overpressure of the blast like a volcano. The smell of scorched earth and high explosives filled the immediate atmosphere, even as the sound of the explosion rolled across the valley like a continuous clap of thunder. The Iranian defenders reacted in a frantic, disjointed surge of panic. Below the ridge, a battery of 23mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire, sending ribbons of glowing green tracers arching into the black sky in every direction. The gunners were firing blindly, their radar guidance shattered by the earlier electronic attacks, but the sheer volume of lead turned the air into a lethal lattice of light. A shoulder-fired missile was launched from the perimeter fence, its white exhaust trail zigzagging wildly as it struggled to find a heat source in the chaos. The American pilots deployed bundles of magnesium flares, which drifted down like burning stars, confusing the missile's seeker head until it detonated harmlessly in the empty air. black smoke continued to boil out of the shattered hillside, obscuring the primary entrance to the bunker complex. The satellite uplink dishes atop the ridge had been snapped like toothpicks by the ground heave, and the primary power grid for the facility had gone dark, leaving only the flickering orange light of the fires to illuminate the carnage. The radio channels once used by the Iranian command staff were now filled with nothing but static, and the frantic, overlapping shouts of local units, realizing that their central leadership had been severed. The transition from a functioning military hub to a smoking tomb had taken less than 10 seconds. The following flight of 4 aircraft moved in to strike the secondary targets. They targeted the backup generator buildings and the hardened communication bunkers located 500 meters from the main site. Each pilot followed the same clinical procedure, releasing their munitions into the heart of the facility. The secondary explosions were smaller but no less decisive, cutting the last remaining fiber optic cables that linked the site to the rest of the country. The smell of burning diesel and melted plastic rose from the valley as the generator farm erupted in a series of bright blue electrical arcs. The air wing leader checked his clock, 2 in the morning. The primary strategic objective of the night had been achieved. The central nervous system of the Iranian military in the south was effectively dead. The command bunker strike had been executed with surgical precision, utilizing the heavy kinetic energy of the bunker busters to penetrate defenses that had been designed to survive a nuclear near miss. In the cockpit of the lead fighter, the pilot took a long, steady breath of oxygen, his hands steady on the controls as he looked back one last time at the burning ridge. The environment around the target was now a hellish landscape of fire and dust. The intense heat of the detonations had crystallized the sand around the impact points into jagged shards of glass. The tracers from the anti-aircraft guns began to slacken as the crews realized the attackers were already moving out of range. The silence that followed the final explosion was heavy and absolute, broken only by the distant, receding roar of the jet engines. The strike package began its climb back toward the safety of the higher altitudes, leaving behind a command network that was now a disconnected series of burning holes in the ground. 2:15 in the morning. The dark, choppy waters of the Strait of Hormuz. The destroyer, USS Mason, designation DDG-87, was positioned 20 miles south of the Iranian naval base at Bandar Abbas, acting as the primary picket ship for the carrier strike group. Inside the Combat Information Center, the atmosphere was one of intense, silent focus. The room was bathed in the dim blue light of the tactical consoles, highlighting the concentrated faces of the radar operators and the tactical action officer. On the primary air and surface search radar, a cluster of 14 high-speed contacts had just emerged from the shadow of the Iranian coastline, moving at 45 knots on an intercept course. These were Iranian Boghammar fast attack craft, small fiberglass boats that utilized speed and numbers to threaten much larger vessels. The air on the open bridge of the USS Mason was cold and heavy with the fine mist of salt spray as the ship increased speed to 30 knots. The commander of the Mason did not hesitate. The Iranian strategy was a classic swarm maneuver, an attempt to saturate the destroyer's defenses with multiple targets from different angles. However, the United States Navy had spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. The tactical action officer coordinated the defense with 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters that were already airborne and loitering 5 miles ahead of the ship. The helicopters were the primary tool for this engagement, providing a mobile platform that could strike the boats long before they reached the range of their own shoulder-fired missiles or rocket launchers. The pilots of the lead MH-60 Sierra adjusted their flight paths, descending to 50 meters above the white-capped waves. Through their night vision goggles, the world was a high-contrast landscape of green phosphorus, where the white wakes of the Iranian boats looked like scars. On the surface of the black water, the forward-looking infrared sensor in the nose of the helicopter locked onto the heat signature of the lead boat's outboard engines. The weapon systems officer in the back of the helicopter prepared the AGM-114 Hellfire missiles, confirming the laser lock on the target. The smell of recycled air and the vibration of the rotor blades filled the small cabin. As the crew waited for the final authorization to engage, clear to engage, weapons free, the order crackled over the secure radio link from the Mason. The first Hellfire missile shrieked off the rail, its solid rocket motor leaving a brief, blinding trail of white light in the darkness. The missile struck the lead Boghammar squarely in the center of its hull. The fiberglass structure offered no resistance to the shaped charge warhead, which detonated with a sharp, high-velocity crack. The fuel tanks of the small boat erupted instantly, sending a tower of orange flame 20 meters into the air. Debris, including fragments of the heavy machine gun mount, was thrown in every direction, hissing as it hit the cold water. The second boat in the formation attempted to swerve away from the fireball, but it was already being tracked by the second helicopter. On the deck of the USS Mason, the 25mm Mark 38 chain gun on the starboard side roared to life. The sound was a rhythmic, mechanical thud that vibrated through the steel deck plates, a sound the sailors felt in their chests. The gun fired at a rate of 200 rounds per minute, the orange tracers skipping off the surface of the swells before finding the thin hull of a third Iranian craft. The heavy rounds tore through the fiberglass and the personnel on board with terrifying ease. The smell of burnt cordite and the sharp, chemical tang of spent shell casings drifted across. The deck quickly swept away by the wind of the ship's passage. The coordination between the ship's guns and the airborne helicopters was a display of clinical, lethal professionalism. The engagement took place at coordinates 27 degrees 8 minutes north, 56 degrees 12 minutes east. As the battle progressed, the Iranian swarm began to lose its cohesion. The loss of 3 boats in the first 90 seconds had shattered their formation. The remaining craft attempted to fire their 70mm rockets, but the range was too great and the motion of the sea made accurate aiming impossible. The rockets fell harmlessly into the water, hundreds of meters short of the destroyer. The USS Mason continued its relentless defense, the 5-inch Mark 45 gun on the bow firing a single high-explosive round that detonated near a cluster of 2 boats, the concussion alone nearly flipping them over in the water. By 2:45 in the morning, the surface threat had been neutralized. 6 Iranian boats were either sinking or engulfed in flames, their crews visible as dark shapes bobbing in the oil-slicked water. The remaining 8 craft had turned back toward the Iranian coast, fleeing at maximum speed to the protection of their land-based batteries. The helicopters maintained a visual on the retreating vessels until they crossed back into territorial waters, then returned to the Mason for refueling. The surface of the Strait of Hormuz was now dotted with the orange glows of burning wrecks, the only remaining evidence of the failed swarm attack. The crew of the USS Mason did not celebrate. They remained at battle stations, their eyes on the radar screens for any sign of a second wave or a submarine threat. The ship's medical team stood ready in the hangar bay, though no American casualties had been reported. The neutralization of the surface threat ensured that the carrier, the USS Gerald R. remained undisturbed as it continued to recover and launch aircraft further to the south. The professionalism of the United States Navy sailors had turned a chaotic skirmish into a decisive victory, proving once again that technology and training were the ultimate multipliers in the modern naval battlefield. 2:50 in the morning. The dark airspace over the northern Persian Gulf, just south of Keshem Island. The returning strike package of FA-18 fighters was at 28,000 feet, their fuel states low and their ordnance gone. Providing top cover were 2 F-35 Bravo fighters from the Marine Corps, flying in a wide orbit at 35,000 feet. Their advanced sensors, integrated into the AN/APG-81 active electronically scanned array radar, suddenly detected 4 fast-moving contacts climbing rapidly from the military airfield at Bandar Abbas. These were Iranian 4 Phantoms, legacy aircraft but still lethal, in the hands of experienced pilots attempting a desperate intercept of the withdrawing American force. The cockpit of the lead F-35 was silent, illuminated only by the massive panoramic touchscreen display that showed the 4 red diamonds of the enemy closing at 1,200 kilometers per hour. The Iranian pilots were flying with their radars active, searching the dark sky for the FA-18 strike package, but they were completely unaware of the two stealth fighters loitering 5,000 feet above them. The F-35 Bravos, operating in their beast mode configuration, used their passive electro-optical targeting systems to track the heat signatures of the Phantom's twin engines. The Marine pilots maintained total electronic silence, receiving a continuous data stream from the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye that kept them perfectly positioned behind and above the ascending interceptors. The air in the cockpit was pressurized and filtered, the only scent being the faint plastic smell of the pilot's flight mask. At 2:54 in the morning, the lead F-35 pilot received the commit authority from the strike group commander. At coordinates 26 degrees 42 minutes north, 55 degrees 58 minutes east, the engagement began. The Marine pilot selected DISMANTLED two AIM-120 advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles from his internal weapon bay. He did not need to maneuver into a classic dogfight position. The high off-bore sight capability of the missiles allowed him to fire while still in level flight. The trigger was squeezed. The internal bay doors snapped, open with a sharp, mechanical whine that was felt through the pilot's seat. The AIM-120 missile dropped into the freezing slipstream for a fraction of a second before its solid-fuel rocket motor ignited with a deafening roar. A streak of white-hot fire punched through the darkness, the missile accelerating instantly to 4 times the speed of sound. The heat from the exhaust washed against the underside of the F-35 as the missile climbed toward its target. The pilot watched the digital countdown on his visor, his hands steady on the side stick controller. The missile's active radar seeker head locked onto the lead Iranian Phantom at a range of 15 kilometers. The 4 pilot, finally alerted by his radar warning receiver, began a frantic brake turn to the left, pumping out clouds of aluminum chaff to distract the incoming weapon. It was a futile gesture against the advanced logic of the American missile. The AIM-120 warhead, containing 22 pounds of high explosives, detonated exactly 2 meters from the Phantom's right engine. The blast wave shattered the fuselage, the high-velocity fragments shredding the fuel lines and the hydraulic systems in a single microsecond. The lead Phantom erupted into a massive fireball that bleached the midnight sky a brilliant, sickly orange. The aircraft did not merely catch fire. It came apart in a violent spray of burning titanium and jet fuel. The right wing was sheared off at the root, sent tumbling into the dark void below, while the main fuselage transformed into talkative, a spiraling comet of wreckage. The heat from the explosion was so intense that it was detected by the infrared sensors of the USS Gerald R. Ford, over 100 miles away. Debris rained down toward the surface of the Gulf, hissing as it hit the water in a series of white splashes. The remaining 3 Iranian pilots reacted with immediate, uncoordinated panic. Seeing their leader vaporized by an unseen attacker, they broke formation and dove for the deck, pushing their throttles into full afterburner to reach the safety of the land-based air defense umbrella. They abandoned the pursuit of the FA-18 strike package, their only goal now being survival. The Marine F-35 pilots did not pursue. Their mission was to protect the egressing strike force, not to engage in a war of attrition over the Iranian mainland. They remained in their high-altitude orbit, watching the 3 retreating heat signatures disappear into the ground clutter of the Iranian coast. By 3:15 in the morning, the airspace over the Gulf was clear. The FA-18 fighters of the strike package had reached their mid-air refueling point and were safely taking on fuel for the final leg of their journey back to the carrier. The F-35 Bravos followed them, their stealth coatings intact, and their mission accomplished. The brief, violent encounter had proven the total air-to-air dominance of the United States Navy and Marine Corps. 1 Iranian aircraft was destroyed, and the remainder of their interceptor force had been effectively cowed into retreat. The silence returned to the cockpit of the lead F-35. The pilot adjusted his oxygen flow, the adrenaline of the kill beginning to subside. Below, the orange glow of the burning Phantom wreckage was fading as it sank beneath the surface of the Persian Gulf. The transition from lethal combat back to a routine return to base was seamless, a testament to the training and technology of the American forces. The Iranian command network was not just blind and broken on the ground. Its attempts to strike back in the air had been met with a swift and absolute conclusion. 3:20 in the morning, 10 miles northeast of the primary command bunker site near Shiraz. While the central hub was a smoking ruin, the Iranian military still possessed a series of redundant nerves, a network of satellite uplink stations, and high-frequency microwave relay towers scattered across the high plateau. Without the destruction of these secondary nodes, the fragmented remnants of the Southern Command could still potentially coordinate a local defense or transmit vital intelligence to Tehran. 4 FA-18 fighters from Strike Fighter Squadron 87, loitering at 22,000 feet, were assigned to sever these remaining connections. The pilots used their AN/ASQ-28 targeting pods to scan the terrain below, the infrared sensors rendering the landscape in a stark, thermal palette of white and black. The primary target for this phase was a hardened communication farm located at coordinates 29 degrees 34 minutes north, 52 degrees 37 minutes east. On the targeting screens, the 3 massive satellite dishes glowed with a dull white heat, indicating they were still powered and operational. The surrounding desert air was thin and crisp, a sharp contrast to the humid environment of the flight deck they had left hours ago. The pilots operated with a methodical, cold precision, their hands moving over the throttles and side sticks with the muscle memory of 1,000 simulator hours. Each aircraft was armed with 4 500-pound GBU-38 Joint Direct Attack munitions, the perfect tool for precise, low-collateral destruction of soft electronic infrastructure. The lead pilot initiated the attack run, slaving his first 2 bombs to the coordinates of the largest uplink dish. Cactus 1-1, Rifle 1 and 2, he announced over the encrypted radio, his voice calm and rhythmic. The release was felt as a pair of sharp, upward jolts as the 500-pound weapons separated from the wing stations. The bombs fell through the freezing night air, their GPS guidance kits chirping as they calculated the exact path to the target. In the cockpit, the pilot watched the time-to-impact counter crawl toward 0. The targeting pod remained locked on the center of the dish, providing a high-definition view of the impending impact. The warhead struck with simultaneous precision. The first GBU-38 punched through the center of the parabolic dish, its high-explosive filler detonating instantly. The 60-foot-wide lattice of steel and aluminum did not just break, it buckled and vaporized. A brilliant white flash illuminated the surrounding hills for a fraction of a second, followed by a shockwave that shredded the sensitive microwave receivers mounted on the nearby towers. The second bomb hit the auxiliary power building 50 meters away, turning the diesel generators and the massive batteries into a molten heap of lead and acid. The smell of ozone, burning plastic, and scorched insulation would have been overwhelming on the ground, a chemical signature of a dead network. The second pair of fighters moved in to mop up the remaining relay towers. These structures were slender, skeletal frames of steel, but they were essential for the VHF and UHF radio links that connected the Iranian field units. The pilots rippled their remaining munitions, dropping 1 bomb on each of the 4 main towers in a single pass. The results were visually spectacular through the infrared sensors. As the bombs hit the base of the structures, the steel supports were severed by the blast, causing the towers to fold over on themselves like falling trees. They crashed into the dry earth, sending up plumes of dust that looked like white ghosts in the thermal displays. The environment of the plateau had been permanently altered in less than 5 minutes. What had once been a sophisticated, high-speed communication gateway was now a series of burning craters and twisted metal. The pilots conducted a quick battle damage assessment, circling the site one last time to ensure no functional equipment remained. The satellite dishes were gone, the relay towers were flat, and the underground cable vaults had been collapsed by the overpressure of the hits. The Iranian Southern Command was now truly isolated, reduced to using messengers or unencrypted, short-range radios that the United States Navy could easily intercept and jam. He checked his fuel state. He was down to 4,000 pounds, enough for a comfortable egress to the tanker track over the Gulf. He signaled the rest of his flight to form up for the climb to 28,000 feet. Behind them, the fires at the communication farm cast long, flickering shadows across the desert floor, joining the larger conflagration of the primary bunker site to the south. The secondary objectives had been neutralized with 100% efficiency, ensuring that the strategic impact of the night's operation was total. There would be no coordination, no warning, and no organized response from the Iranian forces in the sector. The air wing's work over the mainland was nearing its conclusion. As the fighters turned south, the pilots felt the first hints of fatigue, the adrenaline of the strikes beginning to fade into a focused, professional exhaustion. They were now ghosts leaving the graveyard they had created. The darkness of the Iranian interior remained absolute, save for the orange scars of the fires that marked the end of the command network. The mission had been a masterclass in the application of carrier-based air power, a surgical removal of an adversary's ability to think and act on a national scale. 3:30 in the morning. The jagged peaks of the Zagros Mountains were falling away behind the strike package as the aircraft turned south, toward the Persian Gulf. The air in the cockpits was freezing, the internal heaters struggling against the minus 40-degree temperature at an altitude of 28,000 feet. The pilots of Strike Fighter Squadron 87 monitored their fuel gauges with a clinical focus, calculating the exact burn rate required to reach the designated refueling track. Below them, the Iranian coastline was a jagged line of black against the slightly lighter black of the sea. The intense adrenaline of the target run was now being replaced by the steady, grinding pressure of the long return flight. The flight leads checked in with the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye, confirming that all 24 aircraft of the strike package had cleared the Iranian mainland. The report was a welcome one: 0 losses and 0 aircraft with major mechanical failures. However, the fuel states were critical across the formation, with several fighters down to less than 3,000 pounds of fuel. This was the long egress, a phase where the greatest enemy was not the Iranian military, but the simple physics of range and consumption. The pilots adjusted their throttles to the most efficient cruise settings, their eyes scanning the dark horizon for the faint navigation lights of the aerial tankers. At coordinates 26 degrees north, 54 degrees east, 3 kc 135 stratotankers loitered in a wide, stable orbit. These massive tankers, operated by the United States Air Force, were the invisible lifelines that made the deep strike mission possible. The tankers ran with their external lights, dimmed to a faint green glow to avoid detection by any remaining coastal radar. One by one, the FA-18 fighters moved into the pre-contact position behind the tankers, their pilots fighting the subtle, buffeting turbulence of the larger aircraft's wake. The refueling probe extended from the nose of each fighter with a sharp mechanical whine, seeking the lighted basket at the end of the tanker's refueling hose. This was a delicate dance performed at 500 kilometers per hour in total darkness. The pilots used their night vision goggles to gauge the distance, their hands making tiny, precise corrections on the side stick controllers. The smell of stale sweat and recycled oxygen filled the small cockpits, a sensory reminder of the hours spent under the pressure of the flight suit. Once the probe seated into the basket, the flow of JP-5 fuel began, a life-giving, umbilical connection between the two aircraft. The weight of the fuel caused the fighters to settle slightly, requiring the pilots to increase power to maintain their position. Within 5 minutes, each aircraft had taken on an additional 10,000 pounds of fuel, enough to complete the recovery to the carrier with a safe reserve. As they topped off their tanks, the pilots performed a visual damage assessment of their wingmen. Using high-powered flashlights, they scanned the airframes of the neighboring jets for any signs of shrapnel damage from the anti-aircraft fire near Shiraz. Apart from a few minor scorch marks from the heat of the missile launches, the aircraft were clean. The professional satisfaction of a successful mission began to set in, though the pilots remained disciplined and silent on the radio. They were now crossing back into international airspace, leaving the chaos of the Iranian command network hundreds of miles behind them. The environment of the high-altitude egress was one of surreal isolation. Above the Gulf, the stars were brilliant and uncaring, reflected in the calm waters below as thousands of tiny points of light. The horizon, to the east, was still black, but the pilots knew the sun would be rising in less than 3 hours. Now, they were alone in the dark. The only sound the steady, comforting roar of their twin engines. The navigation systems pointed them toward the moving coordinates of the USS Gerald R. Ford, which was currently steaming at 25 knots to the southwest. The fatigue was real. The pilots had been in their cockpits for nearly 5 hours, most of that time spent in high-stress, high-G environments. Their necks were sore from the weight of the helmets and night vision goggles, and their eyes were dry from the constant scanning of the digital displays. They used short bursts of conversation over the internal flight comms to stay alert, discussing fuel management and recovery procedures. The long egress was the final test of their endurance, a slow transition from the violence of combat back to the structured reality of carrier operations. By 4:15 in the morning, the strike package had completed its refueling and was descending toward the carrier's Marshall stack. The green glow of the carrier's landing lights was not yet visible, but the ship's tactical air navigation system was already providing a steady heading. The pilots prepared for the final challenge of the night, landing a 30-ton supersonic jet on a pitching steel deck in the middle of the ocean. The mission was almost over, but the most dangerous part of the naval aviator's job was just beginning. 4:30 in the morning. The USS Gerald R. Ford turned into the 30-knot wind. Its massive hull carving a white furrow through the dark waters of the Persian Gulf. The flight deck was a theater of controlled chaos, illuminated by the amber floodlights and the rhythmic flashing of the landing signal officer's platform. The air was a thick, suffocating mixture of burnt rubber, hot hydraulic fluid, and the sharp, ionized smell of the catapult steam still clinging to the deck plates. Above the ship, the first of the returning FA-18 fighters entered the landing pattern, their navigation lights blinking in the dark like low-velocity stars. The recovery of a full air wing after a combat mission was the most dangerous and demanding task in naval aviation, requiring the absolute synchronization of over 500 deck personnel. The first fighter, piloted by the commander of Strike Fighter Squadron 87, appeared on the final approach path. The aircraft was low on fuel and dirty, its wings stained with the soot of the Iranian interior. At 150 knots, the pilot followed the meatball, the glowing amber light of the Fresnel lens, until the aircraft slammed onto the flight deck with a violent, bone-jarring impact. The tailhook caught the number 3 arresting wire, a 2-inch thick steel cable that decelerated the 30-ton jet from 250 kilometers per hour to a dead stop in less than 100 meters. The screech of the wire being pulled through the arresting engine resonated through the entire ship, a sound of raw friction and massive kinetic energy. As soon as the aircraft stopped, the pilot raised the hook and folded the wings. Yellow-shirted taxi directors immediately swarmed the jet, using their glowing wands to guide the fighter out of the landing area and toward the starboard elevator. The deck crew moved with a predatory efficiency, their color-coded jerseys identifying their specific roles in the rearmament process. Purple shirts, known as grapes, pulled heavy fuel hoses across the non-skid surface to begin the pressure refueling process, while red shirts, the ordnancemen inspected the empty weapon pylons for any hung munitions or electrical faults. The scent of jet fuel and salt spray was joined by the acrid stink of hot brakes as the aircraft taxied into its parking spot. The recovery continued for 45 minutes. Every 90 seconds, another fighter slammed onto the deck, the arresting wires snapping back into position with a rhythmic, metallic clang. The E-2 Charlie Hawkeye, the last aircraft to return, landed. With the graceful stability of a much larger plane, its massive radar dome casting a rotating shadow across the flight deck as it taxied toward the bow. By 5:15 in the morning, the entire strike package was back on board. The hangar bay below was a hive of activity as maintenance crews began the post-flight inspections, checking every engine, blade, and sensor housing for damage from the high-stress maneuvering over the Zagros Mountains. Inside the pilot's ready room, the atmosphere was one of quiet, professional decompression. The pilots sat in their high-backed leather chairs, still wearing their flight suits and survival vests, their faces etched with the deep lines of exhaustion and G-force strain. They sipped hot coffee and spoke in low, clipped sentences as they began the formal debriefing process. Intelligence officers moved among them, collecting the digital data cards from the targeting pods and recording the pilots' visual observations of the bunker strikes and the air intercept over the Gulf. There was no boasting or celebration. The mission was simply a job performed to the highest standard of the United States Navy. On the flight deck, the preparation for a potential second wave was already underway. The red shirts were busy loading fresh AIM-120 missiles and 500-pound GBU-38 bombs onto the standby aircraft. The mechanical whine of the ordnance hoists rising from the magazines below was a constant background noise, a reminder of the carrier's nearly bottomless magazine of high-precision weapons. The deck was being spotted, moving the fueled and armed aircraft back toward the catapults. In case the Iranian military attempted a retaliatory strike at dawn, the sailors worked with a grim, focused energy, their movements fluid and practiced despite the hours of sleeplessness. The environment shifted as the first faint hint of gray light appeared on the eastern horizon. The humidity of the Gulf was beginning to rise, coating the steel of the aircraft and the faces of the sailors in a fine, sticky sheen. The USS Gerald R. Ford continued its steady course, a sovereign piece of American territory moving through a hostile region. The transition from the violence of the night to the industrial routine of the morning was a testament to the discipline of the crew. They had dismantled a nation's command network in a single night, and now they were simply preparing to do it again if the order came. The commanding officer of the carrier strike group stood on the bridge, watching the sun begin to break the surface of the water. He received a final status report from the air boss. All aircraft recovered. Currently mission capable for immediate relaunch. The recovery and rearmament phase was complete, end quote. The carrier was once again a loaded weapon, its flight deck crowded with the most lethal aircraft in the world, ready to project power at a moment's notice. The mission had entered its final assessment phase, and the strategic weight of the night's work was about to be measured in the halls of power thousands of miles away. 6 in the morning. The Persian Gulf. The flag bridge of the USS Gerald R. Ford was silent, save for the low hum of the tactical data links and the quiet rustle of printed intelligence reports. The sun was now a bruised purple line on the horizon, casting a long, metallic light across the water that reflected off the gray steel of the carrier's superstructure. Admiral Miller, commander of Carrier Strike Group 11, stood at the forward windows, looking out over the flight deck where the last of the strike aircraft were being chained down for the morning. The retaliatory strike was over. The Air Wing had successfully executed one of the most complex carrier-based operations in recent history, and the initial battle damage assessment was now sitting on the Admiral's digital tablet, written in the cold, precise language of a military campaign report. The primary strategic objective, the total neutralization of the southern Iranian command and control network, had been achieved with 100% effectiveness. The central command bunker south of Shiraz, buried 60 meters beneath the limestone ridge, was confirmed as a total loss. Post-strike satellite imagery, analyzed by the National Reconnaissance Office, showed the massive ground heave and internal collapse of the facility. The 2,000-pound GBU-31 bunker busters had penetrated the hardened cap and detonated within the subterranean levels, severing the physical and electronic connections that linked the Iranian Southern Command to the central leadership in Tehran. The heat signatures, from the site remained high 2 hours after the strike, indicating that internal fires were still consuming the remaining infrastructure. The secondary objectives had fared no better. The communication farm northeast of the bunker site was reported as 95% destroyed. All 3 primary satellite uplink dishes had been vaporized, and 4 out of 4 microwave relay towers were flat. The Iranian integrated air defense system along the coast between Bandar Abbas and the city of Minab was in a state of total collapse. 12 major radar installations had been neutralized, either by kinetic harm missile strikes or high-power electronic jamming from the EA-18 Gulf Growlers. The coastal perimeter was now a 60-kilometer gap through which any subsequent American strike packages could fly with near-total impunity. In terms of naval engagement, the USS Mason had successfully defended the strike group's perimeter. 6 Iranian Boghammar fast attack craft were confirmed sunk, with an estimated 40 personnel killed in action. The remaining 8 vessels of the swarm had retreated to the safety of the shallows near Bandar Abbas, their combat effectiveness shattered. In the air, the engagement over the northern Gulf had resulted in the destruction of 1 Iranian 4 Phantom fighter, with both crew members confirmed killed in the high-altitude explosion. The remaining 3 Iranian interceptors had fled the engagement and were currently being tracked by the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye as they landed at their home bases, likely suffering from the psychological impact of being engaged by a stealth opponent they could never see. The cost to the United States Navy was remarkably light, a testament to the professionalism and technological edge of the carrier air wing. 0 aircraft were lost during the 6-hour operation. 2 FA-18 fighters had returned with minor shrapnel damage to their vertical stabilizers from 23mm anti-aircraft fire, but both were expected to be mission-capable within 12 hours of repair. All 24 pilots and weapon systems, officers of the strike package, were safe and undergoing mandatory post-mission debriefings. The total ammunition expenditure for the night included 48 Joint Direct Attack munitions, 12 HARM missiles, 2 AIM-120 air-to-air missiles, and 4 Hellfire missiles. The geopolitical environment of the Persian Gulf had shifted dramatically since midnight. The strategic silence, now emanating from southern Iran, was a loud message to the regional actors. By severing the command network, the United States had not just destroyed buildings, it had removed the enemy's ability to coordinate a response, launch, synchronize drone attacks, or provide real-time intelligence to its proxies. The command and control nodes were not merely broken, they were surgically extracted from the national defense grid. The Iranian military in the south was now a collection of isolated units, unable to see, hear, or speak to one another in any meaningful way. As the sun cleared the horizon, the humidity began to thicken the air, creating a soft haze that blurred the line between the sky and the sea. The USS Gerald R. Ford continued its steady patrol, its presence a permanent reminder of American reach. The mission, Operation Iron Resolve, was officially closed in the logs of the 7th Fleet. The Admiral signed the final report and sent it via secure satellite link to the Pentagon, where the results would be presented to the National Security Council within the hour. The carrier group would remain at modified battle stations for the next 48 hours to monitor for any signs of escalation. But the initial assessment was clear. The retaliatory strike had been a decisive, overwhelming success. The scent of salt spray and the industrial hum of the ship returned to the forefront of the Admiral's senses. The intensity of the night was fading into the routine of a carrier at sea. The sailors on the deck below were already starting their morning cleaning stations, their movements disciplined and steady. The command network of an adversary had been dismantled in the dark of night, and now, in the light of day, the United States Navy was ready for whatever came next. The operation was a clinical demonstration of modern warfare, fast, precise, and absolute.